Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for another RPI Consultants Webinar Wednesday. This is Michael and John part 2.
We're back.
Today, this afternoon, we're discussing how to migrate your data and your content into the cloud. This is going to cover a wide variety of cloud topics, and expect this webinar to run a little longer than most of ours do, probably just over half an hour. So buckle in, but I think we've got some really good material ready for you. As far as other upcoming webinars, next month on Wednesday, November 6th, we have a Kofax themed webinar series, What's New in Kofax Total Agility 7.6, subtitle The Elimination of Silverlight. And then in the afternoon, we have What's New in Kofax ReadSoft Online. If you haven't joined us for our office hours, that's a different kind of webinar where we take a deep dive into a technical topic with hands-on demonstrations, taking questions and demo requests from attendees. So we have one of those a month. The October one is over Perceptive Content Application Plans, and then the November office hours is over Perceptive Experience. Most of you know me. My name is John Marney, manager of the Content and Process Automation practice here at RPI. That's us here in Kansas City. I have been doing this for around a decade now, as Michael reminded me just a few minutes ago, and that made me feel really good. And I do consider myself an AP automation guru.
And hello, I'm Mike Medson. I'm a lead consultant here, primarily working with Perceptive Content, Brainware programs, and I work a lot with back office and higher education. As the Office Dungeon Master, we're hoping for a nat 20 on this webinar.
Oh, yes. All right. So our agenda today, first we're going to cover what is cloud. Most of you know what it is. Probably all of you know what it is, but we're going to cover what it is in context for this discussion. Then we're going to discuss how the cloud applies to your actual content and business process applications. We're going to cover a case study of something we've actually done. In this case, it's Perceptive OSMs with Azure storage. However, that case study is pretty much something that can directly apply to a Kofax use case or an on-base use case. And then we're going to give you some strategies to get started with your cloud migration. So why should everyone hedge this webinar a little bit, Mike?
Well, as everybody knows, cloud is constantly evolving. So what we're covering today is going to be as up-to-date information as possible that we can get today, but for all we know, something could change tomorrow. So just always go to your service website to check stuff out, take a look at your documentation just to be sure.
And this information is true right now to the best of our ability, but not only do things change, but sometimes we get things wrong. So let's jump in. What is cloud? What is cloud? What if I told you that the cloud is just someone else's computer, or probably more appropriately, a whole bunch of people's computers? So first, let's talk about the infrastructure that actually goes into cloud. And you're hearing this for the first time ever. This is a John Marney certified marketing terms. I Googled it. Nobody else has done this before. So I'm breaking the cloud down into two different types of implementations. The first is your bright cloud. And this is really the best version of cloud. And this means that you're taking everything you have today and really re-envisioning it and reapplying it into the cloud. So it takes your data and your files and your applications and distributes them across multiple servers and data centers. That's largely driven by a Linux backend, though you would never know it. Because the traditional servers, file systems, etc., don't exist. There's nothing for you to go manipulate and drag and drop, and there's no control panel in a Windows server, right? So it's less specific application support. You're not going to find, for the most part, on-base 18 supported as an Amazon Web Service. It's mostly web-based services that can be utilized in connection with each other for a series of services. So it is a service-oriented architecture. And then you have the dark cloud. Dark cloud is actually basically just what you're doing today, but on someone else's hardware. It allows you to spin up Windows or Linux virtual machines to run whatever you want. And as far as your files and storage are concerned, you can do blobs, which some applications support today. You can do your traditional file, directory system. And this is what actually allows you, for the most part right now, to map that cloud storage to your on-premise traditional file systems and directories. So what are the technologies involved? And this is mostly bright cloud versus dark cloud. So you've got blobs versus file shares. So blobs are actually in support of a lot more different file types, file structures, data types. It's not just files. File shares are your more traditional file system like what you'd find in Windows. Whichever it is, if you want to map it to a Windows file system, like a mapped drive, map your Z drive out to an Azure file share, it must support a technology called SMB 3.0. And on top of that, there are a number of options, whether you're using blobs or file shares. So the three main pieces are going to be your replication, your performance, and your location.
This is generally one of the easier first steps into cloud if you're trying to migrate that direction.
Absolutely. You want to look at your files first. So the replication is how redundant is this data? And all of them, they begin at 99.999, like 6 nines. And it's really deciding how many nines you want, or how many testable places you want after that. So it goes 6, 11, 16, something like that. Performance-wise, we're talking generally about hot versus cold storage. Cold being something that may take longer for the services to retrieve. Hot meaning it's meant to be more readily available. And then the location is the region or the where the actual data center exists. But it can also mean how redundant is that data within a given data center or region. So that if you did have, if they did suffer some sort of hardware failure or loss, how quickly can that data be retrieved? Next, you've got cloud databases versus traditional databases, SQL Server or Oracle.
Yeah, the cool thing about cloud databases is that we're no longer talking about just a standard database table where you may store just string values or something like that. Cloud DBs actually allow us to place objects in specific locations where we can access those, even applications. So it's really interesting what you can get into with the Cloud DB.
Yeah, you really could store tables inside of tables inside of tables. It's all generally structured in JSON, so it's not really a traditional relational database, though you can structure it to act kind of like that, or really act just like that. And there is some ability to migrate existing SQL databases into a cloud database. So for example, Azure offers the Cosmos DB. There is a path for that, but that may not necessarily be the wisest way to implement. What we're going to talk about a little bit later is a hybrid approach that allows you to use your traditional SQL servers and utilize some database services. And then lastly, you have kind of your cloud services versus just virtual machines. So the cloud services seek to just fill gaps or replace specific components inside your organization. So we're talking about things like web app development and app hosting, or your Visual Studio work could all take place in the cloud. Data management and access management, so things like your Active Directory. Whereas your virtual machines really are meant for more specific applications that are meant to run on a Windows server or a Linux server. And there are more advanced services available, such as there's a Connect API for your mixed reality. There's Internet of Things, and there's even the hottest trend in cloud technology, blockchain. And we know what that is.
The nice thing about cloud services is that it's something that, like, if we're talking about a back office situation and you have approvers that are on the go, that makes it much easier for them to just log in wherever they're at to do what they need to do.
Absolutely. So there's a ton of providers out there, right? So we kind of break these down into 3 tiers. You've got your pure commercial, which are the big players, Amazon, Microsoft, Oracle, IBM, whoever else at this point. Everyone's trying to get into it because there's really money to be made there. There's your sort of mixed consumer and commercial, your Box, Dropbox, whatever, Google Drive. I will definitely say that I wouldn't want to discount these as business solutions. In many cases, providers like Box are our go-to for for business solutions, and they actually can be easier to stand up and integrate with than the pure commercial services. And then you have private providers. These typically are all utilizing the commercial providers. They're just hosts for Amazon or people who can help you manage it, but they're adding services, SLAs, things on top of that to assist you with it. So let's walk through some strategies on the layers that this can be implemented.
Yep, there are a lot of different layers, but keep in mind whenever we talk about this, it's a little confusing whenever you talk about cloud because you have to split it up between what works best for you. So obviously in a perfect world, we would want to move to what we'll get to, the layer 4 enterprise, where we want everything on the cloud, but that just doesn't work in every scenario. So starting in layers or looking at it at layers makes it a little less overwhelming when you're considering moving to the cloud with your business. So for layer 1, that would just be the standard file storage. And this kind of harkens back to a couple slides ago when we talked about some of the different cloud offerings. So file storage is just going to be like if we're running Perceptive content where we can move our OSMs so that we no longer have those internally on a local server. We have that stored somewhere else so that we can be sure that those are backed up and we don't ever have to worry about losing those, and we always have access to them.
Right, so if I wanted to give this a moniker, I would probably call it storage as a service. Then layer 2 is really just taking that storage to the next level. It's giving you the redundancy and the backup security and applying it to your data and your databases. So that's your next largest storage need, and it will also give you some improved disaster recovery. So this is kind of layering data as a service on top of your storage as a service.
And with applications, that's just essentially those hosted applications we talked about a moment ago. So we can link that in with Active Directory, everything that you need to log in and run your applications. No need to spin up your VMs and run through those every single time anymore. We can just connect to it through a URL.
And here's where you can reduce the need for your on-premise virtual machines, if nothing else, but really reduce the need for virtual machines altogether and infrastructure that you manage. But we also want to begin using some more of those actual cloud services available. Email, Office 365 is a perfect layer 3 application. Active Directory, domain controllers, et cetera, can all exist now in a purely cloud-based format.
And layer 4 just kind of pulls all of those together. So our enterprise, just our series of applications, everything that we've got on our system is now moved to the cloud. We're using that as a complete product for our business. So that's really the gold standard of moving everything to an enterprise type cloud solution. But
absolutely. And you'll find that your current business applications may not translate to layer 4, and it will require some re-architecture, some reinvention. But also these providers know this, and they're beginning to work on layer 4 applications of their own. Okay, so let's talk about some of the, what we've talked about is cloud technology in general. It does not apply specifically to the Highland, the Perceptive, or the Kofax. However, we are going to run through the things that they support specifically because that is where most of our clients are coming from. And you're going to find that most of them are the same. It's not super advanced, but there are some intricacies. And Grandma's going to ask us, cloud computing, computers can fly now? No, Grandma. What Perceptive Content can do is via the Highland Cloud, they offer a service to host everything for you. On top of that is their own share-based offering, which is hosted through Highland Cloud. This is for more distributed file sharing instead of within application. Keep in mind that Highland Cloud is basically a tier 4, a tier 3 offering that they're presenting as tier 4. So it's still just a virtual machine, the same thing that you could run on premise.
Mm-hmm. The nice thing about Perceptive Content is that they also allow us to use these external OSM plugins. So using Amazon S3, we can take all of your OSMs, place them on the cloud so that you can then reference those through your cloud service instead of keeping them internally on your local machine, kind of like what we mentioned before.
And this is probably one of the biggest ones to call out because Amazon S3 is an actual tier 4 or tier 3 cloud service and not just a traditional file structure that's on someone else's machine. So this allows you to take advantage of the best redundancies, the best speed, and everything that Amazon or the cloud have to offer.
We talk a lot about disaster recovery and what are we going to do if we lose our OSMs. Well, another thing to consider is just think about the maintenance aspect around having to keep an eye on those drives to make sure that the drives aren't getting too large or anything like that. Once you move everything to the cloud, now all you have to do if you need more space is just buy more space. So it's really
and it can happen automatically.
Yeah, from a maintenance perspective, it's much easier.
So for on-base, you really have the same kind of thing. No cloud services supported yet. On the community portal, they have stated that you can probably make it work on an Azure or Amazon VM, but they're not going to support you. Spoiler alert, it works. However, they do also, just like Perceptive, offer on-base on their own hosted environments called Highland Cloud Service. Kofax Total Agility is a little bit different. So again, Kofax offers this hosted on their hardware, but they do support you implementing this on Microsoft Azure virtual machines.
Mm-hmm. And it's not really specifically called out in the documentation, but we have had success with using AWS with Kofax Total Agility.
And finally, we throw this slide in here just because we work with it a lot and we want to present the information to you. Kofax RPA, robotic process automation, really is one of the things that doesn't make as much sense as a cloud service instead of a cloud platform. So ultimately, it needs a web browser to work most of the time, which means it needs to be installed on an operating system. So if you're not running it in Windows Server, you're probably doing yourself a disservice.
And we put some information here as to which OSs these work with, but there's a lot of pieces of RPA. So all we've displayed here is Design Studio and Robo Server, but just take a look at the documentation to get a complete picture.
I will say though that running RPA on a cloud virtual machine is just about the most perfect implementation that I can think of. And the reason for that is you could actually have the robot go add processing power to the server as needed, so you're only ever paying for what you need and not ever anymore, which would actually be really cool. All right, so we're going to jump into a very specific use case. We're going to walk through the reasons for doing this, the challenges that this organization faced, our approach and our implementation, and some of the results we saw, including some pricing on actually migrating, in this case, a big chunk of our Perceptive object storage out to an Azure storage account. So we had a series of challenges facing this organization. The first thing was that we are dealing with an organization that has a high volume of documents. So when I say high volume, I mean 3 million documents a year or so coming into their Perceptive platform. And that's not even including multiple pages per document. You definitely don't need that high of a volume to see this as a wise thing to deploy, but that definitely helped us find ROI faster. And one of the biggest things that caused this to actually have a cost to begin with was we're constantly having to manage our disk space. So you don't want to throw a whole bunch of extra terabytes onto the Perceptive storage drives because that's wasted space that you could be using for other things. And you know, the disks may not be that expensive, but they still cost something, and they cost something to maintain. So we're frequently adding chunks of disk space multiple times a year to keep up with the growth of the storage matrix. Additionally, that actually costs somebody's time to monitor and manage, and the labor to actually roll out changes to the SAN to accommodate Perceptive's disk space growth. On top of that, we have retention policies.
Yeah, and if anybody's set up a retention policy in Perceptive content, you know that it is not, it seems not complicated, but at the end of the day, when you're actually testing it, it can be pretty frustrating. But I mean, if we're storing everything on the cloud anyway, it makes it a little bit easier to just point out specifically the data we no longer need anymore, and you can just automate it that way.
So, you know, you may know that you want to delete all your documents that are 7 years and older, but you also may know that every document older than 2 years is never accessed and doesn't need to be on this expensive high-speed storage that we have attached to our Perceptive server. So this is another reason why we could introduce some savings to our storage and push this out to something cheaper. So as far as our design, how we approached the solution to this problem, we had selected Azure mostly because, honestly, it was mostly because of our familiarity with it just from being Office 365 people ourselves. I had gone and poked around Azure previously just to see what it offered. Most of what we did you could do on Amazon or any other provider. But there are some cool things that Azure does, or at least has on their roadmap, that others may not ever really be able to replicate. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So the Azure options that we talked about for our storage account in Azure, first was hot versus cold. Again, we talked about that a little bit. That's the speed at which they're promising to deliver retrieved documents to you. For this case, I actually used cold storage. And in my testing, I was going to flip it to hot if it was too slow or didn't work, but the cold storage really worked just fine and there was no noticeable difference. So it probably would be slower the longer it sits in cold storage and not retrieved, but that's really okay, right? That's the point. As far as redundancies, it just depends on the type of documents you're storing, but how redundant you need that data for your own business purposes. Most of the time, these aren't mission critical documents, especially if they're 2 years old or more. So as long as the redundancy is, as long as that is there, and it is as part of cloud, then you should be good with the most basic setup, which is what we used. As far as geolocation, again, that's where is the actual data center located. This was in the eastern United States, so there are multiple data centers in the eastern United States. We picked the one closest to our client. And finally, this is an option which we didn't utilize, but you can set a quota on the storage account if you're worried about some sort of spending amount per month. So you can set it as per number of gigabytes that you want it to use. It can notify you when you're approaching it, all that kind of stuff. So on the Windows side then, right, we had our storage account set up. I could actually log in via my Azure account and drop a file in there if I wanted. And this one again is a actual storage account that supports, it's a file, what do they call it? I can't remember, file storage, and it supports that SMB 3.0 protocol that we talked about. Because the next thing we have to do is on the Windows Server side where Perceptive content is installed, we actually need to map a drive, Z drive, I think is what I used, to the Azure share. And the way I did that is there's a couple PowerShell scripts that I tweaked to just provide my login information and to map that share down to the server. And that way I can navigate directly to those files from the server itself. And if I can see it, that means Perceptive server can see it.
Yep, and once you have all of that set up, you're just down to going into InTool, creating your new OSM trees and pointing to the new directory.
You do have one option. So we had set it up initially just so that files stored into that OSM would apply out to the file share, and that's great. You can use a number of different methods to get those documents in there. You can set up via an InTool command documents from a certain drawer moving out there. But you could go ahead and run a pretty simple iScript to run, or a batch file even, to run an InTool command to actually just migrate documents out to Azure. You could push everything you have out there very easily, and it's just a single migration.
And for people with terabytes of OSMs out there, think about how much space you could save just by doing that.
So, so we had some great results. I tried to get some like real metrics to throw in this slide, but I was not even able to notice a difference between cloud versus on-prem retrieval. So again, over time using cold storage, that storage mechanism or the retrieval mechanism may slow down a little bit. However, just in pure timing, I couldn't identify a difference between retrieval up front. As far as maintenance, there's really virtually none. And the great thing is that it moves from a very technical storage mechanism matrix to really more of a front end or a maintenance to more of a front end maintenance. So you do have to make sure that Azure has a credit card it can bill, and that credit card can expire and all those things, but that's managed through account alerts and everything else. And you also do have to monitor your retention policies, make sure documents are actually moving out to the share and you're utilizing this. But again, that's a front end application mechanism.
Yep, and for our ROI, I mean, we can eliminate some of the stuff that we're needing to do internally, like having that person come out to put in the new hard drive, or the people we pay to migrate that information. Now that Azure is taking care of all of that for us, not only does it bring a huge cost benefit, but it's pretty heavy on peace of mind as well.
And the backups could be their own savings. If you moved your entire storage matrix out to a cloud file storage, you don't really even need to take backups. You might still want to take local backups every once in a while, but you don't need to do it as often, and the incrementals would be practically useless because I believe there are stats showing that local backups are more likely to be destroyed or fail than cloud backups, even in the event of major disaster. So ultimately, there's a lot of hidden savings as well. And again, the time. It's the time of the people who typically have to maintain this. So, Michael. So results. So, okay, so we've got some details. So for the licensing, you do have to have an Azure subscription. It is a free account, and you can do a lot for up to 12 months to poke around some of the free services. For the paid services, like a storage account, it's free for 30 days, and you get up to a $200 credit, which would be more than enough to set it up and test it. And the storage, with all the options I selected that I talked to you about, comes in at 6 cents per gigabyte per month. So if you translate that out to actual document volume, that's going to be roughly $3 per month per 1 million documents.
Which is crazy.
It is crazy. Translated again to the client in question here, you've got 3 million documents a year. So that's $9 a month times 12, $36 a year for this cloud storage. You're definitely paying more than that for their time.
Or even just a hard drive.
Or for a hard drive. You can take that to 10 years and probably pay for a hard drive. So, and there are additional transaction fees that apply to these. And they're extremely low. It's something like another 6 cents per 10,000 transactions. And for many of the storage types, read activity is not considered a transaction, which is most of what you're doing. Only write activity is considered a transaction. So that's negligible. Optionally, if you don't own it already, for Perceptive anyway, the retention policy manager or similar, something to actually manage the move of these documents over time out to cloud storage would be really useful, but you don't need it.
And we've talked about a lot of different products here, so it's hard to give an exact estimate on each one, but we kind of figure around 60 hours of consulting time to do some kind of migration to the cloud should pretty well cover most things.
And as far as expansion opportunities, things you can do in addition to what we've talked about here with the account you already have set up. So you could easily roll additional document types, departments, processes, anything with those retention policies. You can push more and more and more out to this storage account in Azure. Another thing, you can actually move all of your storage to Azure, including config, everything else. One cool thing, the hybrid approach for SQL Server that we talked about a little bit earlier, it's called stretching your SQL Server. And what that does is MS SQL Server actually has features built into the management studio that allow you to push or utilize the Azure web services to push your data out there, and it's all very tightly integrated and easy to set up so that you can actually utilize the functionality of your on-premise SQL Server, but the benefits of the online cloud storage. And finally, once all that is done, we move our servers out there, spin up a few virtual machines on Azure, and the integrations are easy because it's already on the same domain. Okay, so we're going to give you a few strategies on how to do this for yourself. So take it in phases. You don't have to, but I think most IT changes are most consumable in phases. And this is really just a replication of the slide we showed earlier. Phase one is to get your files and your massive storage out into the cloud. We recommend this as a first phase specifically because it really is just space. As long as the files are accessible, you don't really, for the most part, have to think about things like technical specifications. You don't have to think about, will my application run? Does it need dependencies? Do I need to use other web services? So it's easy, and it's also one of the things that might take the longest, purely from a migration standpoint, not an overall implementation standpoint, but you may need a weekend to move or a week to move a whole bunch of files. Phase 2 then is after the biggest chunks of files are moved, other data and databases into the cloud services or cloud storage. Again, this is really just an extension of phase 1, but we are going to try to get all of the, take advantage of all the redundancies, the disaster recovery benefits that are available.
Yep, and phase 3 is when we really start to begin to use cloud services for isolated business functions inside of the business. So move whatever you can to the cloud, especially those that are utilizing data that we've already moved to the cloud. And then that saves you enough time so that you can start planning out how to move everything there.
Right, so as phase 3, you may not be able to rip out OnBase and utilize a web service that can do all the same things, but you could get it into a virtual machine and begin using some more isolated functions that are available within the platform to reduce the reliance on those platforms. And yeah, ultimately the goal should be, if you are committed to a cloud-oriented strategy, sunset the virtual machines that you're using for applications, whether it's on-premise or in a cloud. So a few considerations as far as security that you need to be aware of as you're approaching this. From a user access standpoint and account authentication, you do have to have an actual Azure account. So that means when our Perceptive server in our case study actually goes to retrieve files from that Azure storage account, it does have to actually use a token stored on the server with a blank at azure.com or something like that credentials. As of right now, it's either on the roadmap or freshly implemented, but you cannot use Active Directory that you have on premise credentials on these file shares. So you can't take jmarney@rpic.com and apply permissions to this Azure account. But this is something that's cool because it's all Microsoft, is that this is something they're going to implement if they haven't very recently. Whereas it's not clear whether someone like Amazon would really even have the ability to do that. But on top of that, if you have moved your Active Directory into Azure services, then you can add those users into the storage account. So that becomes much easier.
And then obviously when we talk about network, if everything's on the cloud, we have to have internet access. So just be sure that you have everything set up with a VPN, you're secure, and check all of your ports because you may have conflicting port values.
It is important to note that anything you set up, whether it's a VM or a storage account or a service in Azure or any other cloud provider, can be made, have a bunch of privacy and security layers applied to it. So you can make it public so that it can be accessed from anywhere or anyone with the right authentication. You can make it semi-private, which I believe would be basically whitelisting IPs that it allows to connect. You can make it completely private, which locks it down to basically like a VPN pipe. And then finally, you have to consider the actual application services themselves. So if you wanted to roll this out in your Perceptive environment, your OnBase environment, your KTA environment today, each of those on-premise run with a certain permissions under a certain service account or what have you. Whatever runs that application ultimately will need a way to utilize the credentials or the account authentication out to that file store. Mostly this is done through the token that I described, but that is something that has to be applied before it will work. So I know that was a lot. I feel like that was a lot. I've been talking a lot. My throat is sore. If you have any questions, please feel free to throw them out. In summary, what we've talked about, and use the GoToWebinar questions panel. If you have anything, please type them in there. In summary, we've talked about what is cloud, some differences between different cloud applications. We've talked about how the cloud actually applies in technical specifications for the business applications that you are probably most commonly here for. We went through a case study of us actually implementing object storage in an Azure storage account, and we talked about some strategies to get started yourself. We'll take any questions that there might be. We're just really good explainers. All right. So we have upcoming webinars. Again, just as a reminder, next month, our office hours are really cool. We get a lot of questions, and I think there's some really good knowledge sharing that takes place during those for our Perceptive. We are on our roadmap for the office hours. We do have COFAX and on-base topics as well. If there's anything that you would like to see a webinar or office hours or anything else presented on that we can put together for you, we're happy to do so. So please just reach out, let us know something that you'd like to hear more about. If you'd like to hear more about this topic, let me know. And there's a little bit about RPI consultants if you don't know anything, but we're a full technical services, professional services practice of well over 100 people at this point. And we are partners with Infor, COFAX, and Highland. So thank you for joining us, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.